Hi, I'm Michael Lynch. I'm the director of the Humanities Institute, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the next in our series of Fellows Talks for this spring semester 2021. Erica Holberg. Erica is a virtue ethicist, a philosopher. She uses historical ethical theories of Aristotle and Kant to examine our own virtues, and vices, and conceptions of pleasure, and account of how pleasure matters for good living. Her research sets aside the question of what pleasure is to focus instead on how pleasure functions in our lives. She's recipient of the North American Kant Society's Wilford Sellers Essay Prize. And her work has appeared in the Southern Journal of Philosophy, the Kantian Review, and Polis, among others. And her book project is about, and indeed her talk today, is about the pleasures of anger and how the phenomenology and practical considerations differ for anger done as an individual or anger done as a group. And I'm excited to hear about that today. Our respondent and another UCHI fellow this year is Scott Wallace. Scott is an award-winning photojournalist who covers the environment and endangered cultures. He's an associate professor of journalism at the University of Connecticut, and he has been a contributor to National Geographic, Harper's, Grand Street, Smithsonian Journeys, Quarterly, and many others. His notable publications include The Unconquered, In Search of the Amazon's Last Uncontacted Prize, and Threatened by the Outside World in the National Geographic in November 2018. I'm so delighted to have both of them here. We'll have first our talk by Erica, and then a brief response by Scott, who will also moderate the questions and answers. All right, without further ado, I turn it over to Erica.
Great, thank you, Michael. I'd first like to thank Michael, Alexis, Yohei, Elizabeth, Drew, and everyone whose work at the Humanities Institute makes it function as well as it does. I want to thank the Center for Hellenic Studies for their grant for this project. And I also would like to thank my fellow fellows, and especially everyone in our writing group. The opportunity to think with others, talk with others, write with others, has been absolutely invaluable. I'm impressed with the community you have here, both within the Humanities Institute, but also within the larger UConn University community, and I feel really lucky to have this year with you. So this talk is offered in the spirit of trying out an argument. And the material is relatively new. I haven't been thinking about it all that long. After all, January 6th was not all that long ago. So if you disagree with something I say, or you think an idea would be better put some other way, or something seems unclear, please just ask me about it, right? This is unruly material, and I really want to hear what you think. Okay, so here we go. So my argument today, I'm going to argue that the incoherence that many of the participants in the January 6th assaults on the US Capitol evinced about what they were doing, how to accomplish their aims, and to what extent their actions were justified can be understood as a collision of the rhetoric and practices of group anger as an activity with the practical and temporal features of anger as a process. In order to make this argument, so this is a diagnostic argument, I should add, and I am in no way trying to exculpate anyone for their actions. Instead, I'm trying to understand the sort of confusion that many of the participants expressed about what they did. So my argument will proceed through 3 steps or sections. First, I'm going to introduce Aristotle's distinction between 2 types of action, that is between process and activity. I'm then going to give a quick overview of Aristotle's account of anger and why this account sees anger as having the structure of process. In the second section, I'm going to examine the differences between individual and group anger. I'm going to argue that there's a possibility that emerges within group anger, where even though anger is fundamentally teleologically structured as a process, it becomes possible to do anger that is structured like an activity, but only when you're in a group, that is only with other people. Finally, in the third section, I'm going to talk about the events of January 6th. I'm going to present my diagnosis of this incoherence that some of the agents expressed about what was done and whether it was justified. And then I'm going to briefly consider some of the implications of my analysis. First section. So here we go, an Aristotelian theory of action. And as I said, for Aristotle, everything we do can be divided into 2 different categories, forms, or types of action. There are processes, and then there are activities. Now, processes have three crucial features. There's a starting point or initiation point, right? And this is going to have some kind of lack or privation attached to it, something that you don't have that you want. There's going to be the endpoint or the goal, the telos, right? That's going to structure the process. It's going to shape everything that you do. And then there's going to be the steps you take that unfold in time in order to get to that end goal, that telos. The examples of processes that Aristotle give include walking and building. With walking, you're going from point A to point B. You have to take steps to get there. Often you take a route or various streets to get to where you're trying to go, and you stop once you get to your destination. Similarly with building, when let's say I want to have a house, I don't have a house. I start to build my house by digging a foundation, laying that foundation, and then a bunch of other steps that I don't really know what they are because I don't know how you build a house, but something like that, right? And if someone were to, let's say, gift me a house, maybe my parents buy me a house, I would stop trying to build a house because I would have the thing I wanted, right? So processes are done for their goal. This is very different from the way activities are structured. In an activity, the point of doing that activity is just to do that activity. So here we go. This means that every moment that you're doing an activity counts as a success, right? Because you're succeeding at what you want. That is, you're succeeding at doing the activity. This means that activity is an end in itself, is the way that Aristotle calls it. And it's also very self-focused. It's attentive to itself. Now, if I was a little bit more skilled at these PowerPoint animations, I would have not just the activity having this kind of nice circular structure, but I would actually also have it rolling down the hill like a snowball. So just imagine that right here, right? And this is a very important feature of how activities work for Aristotle, because it's not just that activities are self-focused, but activities build upon themselves. That is, they snowball, right? The more I do the activity, the more I get into it, it like draws me along. The more I figure out how to do it, the more better I get at it. I develop a kind of expertise. And all of this is done simply by doing the activity, right? So the activity builds upon itself and in a sense accumulates. For Aristotle, pleasure is associated with activity. And this is because of activity structure as an end in itself, right? So when I'm doing an activity, it's a way of feeling powerful, active, successful as an agent. I'm engrossed in what I'm doing. There's a psychologist who talks about this. His name is Csikszentmihalyi, and he writes about being in the flow. And this is very much what Aristotle's interested in too when he talks about activity, right? Where there's a kind of goodness that's inherent or intrinsic to activity that pulls you along and keeps you wrapped up in it. And that experience of being in the activity, being in the flow is like tied up with what pleasure is for Aristotle. Now, in articulating this understanding of pleasure, Aristotle is making a big departure from his teacher, Plato. Now, Plato had argued that actually, rather than pleasure being associated with activities, we find them in processes. And the reason that Plato had argued this was because he's looking at a fairly obvious pleasure that's very important to us, and that is the pleasure of eating, right? For Plato, but actually Aristotle agrees with him. Eating is clearly a process, right? It starts from having lack, that is being hungry, my tummy hurts. And then I start eating, right, which is the process. I'm filling myself up as I take each bite. And then I stop when I get to a certain kind of fullness, right? And there's no more eating. For Plato, this also, the pleasure is in the taking the food in, so filling that lack. And then once I get to the end of the process, there's no more pleasure to be had, right? The making myself better or more full, that's what's pleasant. Okay. This, of course, makes the possibility for pleasure depend on a sort of badness or imperfection. So, it's only possible for me to get pleasure from eating because I'm still hungry. If I'm totally stuffed, there's no more room for food, there's no more room for eating, and there's no more room for pleasure. If I'm good, that's what we say. So do you want something to eat? So no, thanks, I'm good. I'm not hungry. There's also no pleasure there for eating. Now, Aristotle's response to this claim that pleasure is actually associated with process, not activity, is fairly complicated. And, philosophers disagree about how to read this because it's a little bit under-theorized. But basically, what I think Aristotle says is he wants to argue that when I'm eating and it's pleasant, the source of the pleasure is activity, right? So here we go. So the process form is still there, right? I still have to eat, right? Where I go from being hungry to being full. And that process is going to constrain the possibilities for pleasure. I can't keep on having pleasure and eating once I've reached the end, once I'm no longer hungry. But for Aristotle, when I'm eating and it is pleasant, it's because of a kind of elevation in my agency that I'm experiencing, a kind of heightened activity that's actually the source of the pleasure, right? So this means that when we take pleasure in processes, this is unlike pure activities, right? There's a kind of limit or end that happens that constrains, how long I can eat and also how I can eat, right? So I can't eat backwards and I can't keep on eating indefinitely, right? And this is going to constrain the possibilities for pleasure. But Aristotle wants to say still, even in these cases, the pleasure is an activity. I think something that can be said for Aristotle's account of why pleasure looks to be better associated with activity than process is when we think about what the most pleasant cases of eating are. I think when you're very hungry, you're starving, and you quickly are shoveling the food in, that's not the most pleasant experiences of eating. Instead, I think, unfortunately, we don't get to do this now anymore, but I would say the most pleasant experiences of eating are something like a dinner party, right? Where you're taking your time, it's leisurely, you're enjoying each other's company, and you're eating, right? So that's an important part of what's going on. But that's not, there's a full kind of activity of yourself as an agent and what you care about and a connection with others that's happening all through the eating. That, I think, is really what the best eating is, the most pleasurable eating. So here's Aristotle's definition of anger from the Rhetoric. I'm just going to read it out loud. So, let anger be desire involving pain for apparent revenge because of apparent contempt on the part of someone unfitted to treat the person himself or one of those close to him with contempt. Now, I think we should immediately note three things in this definition. First, let's look at the word unfitted. This is a key sign that for Aristotle, when I am angry about something, it's not just that I've experienced some harm. Instead, in calling the person who harmed me unfit to do so, I'm saying you didn't just hurt me, you wronged me, right? You committed an injustice against me. I didn't deserve to be treated this way. So it's not just like, oh, you hurt me. It's like, no, you wronged me, okay? Another thing that we see here is the element that it's about, the anger has an object. That is, that person did me wrong, right? So anger is directed at an agent for something they did. Finally, anger has its desire. There's something that anger wants. And that, as Aristotle says here, is revenge, right? Okay, so together, these three elements show, so as we talked about, first, anger is a response to a perceived injustice, being wronged. Second, anger is directed at the wrongdoer. That is an object for your anger. And third, the aim or telos of anger is revenge upon the wrongdoer. All of these three together show that for Aristotle, anger is structured like a process, right? It has a beginning, the wrong. It has a direction or place that it's looking to go, that is revenge. And then there's steps you take in order to get revenge upon the wrongdoer. Now, when I'm doing anger for Aristotle, there's at least two different sorts of pleasures I can get. So the first most obvious pleasure is getting revenge. If my anger is successful and I actually am able to pull off the thing that my anger wants, and I get the revenge or punishment upon the person who wronged me, that's pleasant, right? But I argue that there's another pleasure, a non-obvious pleasure that's internal to the feeling of anger. I'm just going to read what I wrote here. Simply from within the feeling of anger itself, the angry person is able to begin to restore their lost standing from the perceived injustice. In other words, there is pleasure here in anger, in thinking of oneself as not simply hurt, but as wronged, and moreover, in feeling powerful, active as an agent, and capable of correcting this wrong and exacting revenge. Thus, anger is in itself a reassertion of one's relative standing, and so also one's social status, independent of what the angry individual goes on to do. The anger itself performs this function. What anger is, it's a way of saying, I'm here, God damn it, right? And this kind of assertion of a self, this kind of throwing your weight around that we do when we're angry, there's a pleasure attached to that, right? It's like puffing yourself up. The reason why I think this is very important to note about anger is this pleasure, right, that is internal to the feeling of anger. I want to argue that it's this pleasure that makes it possible for anger to be done as an activity, not for individuals, but for groups. Okay, now we're ready to start the second section. So how different is individual anger from group anger really? You might think, well, you know, when we have an angry group, what we have is we have one angry individual plus another angry individual plus another angry individual. So we just have an aggregate of angry individuals. I want to say that that's not right? That in fact, there's certain kinds of interactions that happen between people in an angry group that make it possible to do anger differently than we're able to do it when we're just an angry individual on our own, right? And so here I have these 12 angry men, right? Where it's not just that these men are angry, but it's the interaction between them that allows for the narrative to unfold in the way it does. So let's get back to this two distinctions in kinds of ways of doing anger, right? So on the first time, we have anger that's structured like a process in a group, right? It's going to have exactly the same features that we saw when we saw anger in individuals, right? So it's going to be the initial starting point. That's going to be the wrong, right? The injustice that's done. And then there's going to be the goal or telos, right? That the anger is directed at, the way to right that wrong. And then there's going to be steps that the anger moves through in order to accomplish its aim or its telos, right? Now, I think that even though there's the same basic shape in the place with group anger that's structured like a process as individual anger, which is also structured like a process, I do think things become a bit fuzzier. So there might not be as much clarity about exactly what the wrong was, right? The injustice that's grounding the anger. There might not be as much clarity about exactly what the goal is that the group is trying to bring about. And there's definitely going to be a little bit less clarity about what the right steps are in order to bring about the desired goal. I do think, though, that this is about the same structure we see for lots of group anger as process in history. I actually think that many of the Black Lives Matters protests this summer had something like the structure of group anger, structure like a process, right? For as a response to George Floyd's murder, among others, there was different goals that these protests often had, and then like they were protesting or trying to bring about or realize these goals. The thing that happens, though, I think the thing that we can see around us now in our contemporary lives is this possibility of group anger that's structured like an activity. Here, the point is to feel the anger, right? So the point is to do the anger, to feel it itself. So just like in an activity, right, we have this kind of circular reinforcing structure. I'm doing the anger in order to feel the anger. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I want the anger, because it feels good, right? I feel reassured by it, right? Now, what are examples of this anger as group activity? I think, you know, something like watching Fox News, right? Where you have a kind of various stories of outrage, of things that you might be upset about. Listening to Rush Limbaugh, rest in peace. That sort of thing where you're tuning in order to hear about some outrage and to feel outraged by that. Doom scrolling, I think, might be an example of something like this. In fact, I think a lot of our political information consumption has something like this structure, where we click on some story of outrage simply in order to feel outraged by it. Now, I think that group anger as an activity has several features that are particular to it, right? That make it quite different from anger that's structured like a process. And the first one I want to mention is that in group anger as an activity, the pressure toward action is greatly lessened. So when I'm angry as an individual, I need to follow through on my anger, right? If I don't, then the people around me who I'm getting angry in front of are just going to start to dismiss me as a blowhard, right? They're not going to take my anger seriously. They're not going to recognize it for what it's meant to be, which is like a call to right an injustice, right? And so there's a kind of need to follow through that happens if I'm going to be angry as an individual. But in group anger, I don't have to do anything at all, right? The point is just to feel the anger. And then I recognize that, you know, somebody else in the group maybe will do something about this. Or maybe somebody even more powerful than me will hopefully feel this anger. They'll feel outraged about it too, and they'll do something about it, right? So when I'm doing group anger, I don't have to follow through and act upon that anger. Another feature that's specific to group anger as an activity is the temporality is changed, right? And this is seen in the way that you get to choose when to start and stop that anger. right? Now, again, when anger is structured like a process, whether it's an individual or a group, the first initiating point is the injustice that's done to you, right? You don't get to pick that. You obviously don't want it to happen. It occurs to you against your will, right? And then you have to, in some sense, immediately respond, right? You can't just put it aside and then choose to pick it up later. But this is unlike group anger as an activity, right? So if I want to like read about the latest outrageous actions that so-and-so did, I can click on it right on my screen. And then when I notice, oh darn, I need to get ready for dinner. I need to start cooking dinner. I can stop, I can walk away, right? And that doesn't obviously delegitimize or invalidate my anger in the way that it would if I was doing anger as a process. Now, like all activities, group anger as an activity provides structure to the agent's life, right? So, what it is for it to be an activity is that you're choosing to do it and you're doing it repeatedly, right? It's I don't know, it's almost like it calls to you, right? And as chosen, activity is understood as to be a reflection of oneself and one's value. So my example here, I like to do the activity of philosophy. That's something that's very important to me. And I take that to be reflective of what I value, what I care about in the world. Moreover, right, if you really get attached to an activity, that might even start to function as a source of identity for yourself, right? So because of my attachment to the activity of philosophy, I call myself a philosopher, right? And something similar like that, I think is true for group anger, right? Where it provides this kind of I don't know, like a kind of sorting or recognition of other people who share your values. And that because of that, there's a lot of, it's not pressure in a bad sense. It's like, it feels good to say, like I'm a Tea Partier, or I'm a constitutional conservative, or I'm a progressive activist, right? That source of identity becomes very important. Now, the thing that I think that makes group anger as an activity a really big deal politically is the way that group anger as activity forms friendship, right? And this, I think, is actually unlike anger as process, right? So individual anger, when I get angry about something that's done to me, what I do is I say, oh, that's outrageous, right? And then I ask my friends, I say, please help me, right? Please come to my aid and help me in avenging this wrongful thing that happened to me, right? So I use my friends to try to get the thing that my anger as a process desires. But I think that group anger as an activity is quite different, because in clicking on to feel that anger, and just for that experience of feeling the anger, you start to actually form friendships with other people who are also doing that. So sharing in that anger, you get to have a bond with everyone else who's also feeling outraged over that thing, right? So you get to have this connection. Admittedly, I do want to say that this is not the ideal of friendship, right? For Aristotle, the ideal of friendship is caring about the other person for their own sake, right? I want what's good for them because I care about them, right? And so I'm going to think about what they value and what they would like. I'm going to use that to think about how I can best help out my true friends. Here, the friendships that's being formed is mediated through the shared commitment to the angry narrative. And this makes it kind of thin, pale version of friendship, because of course, if you decide, I'm not so sure about this anger, I'm not so sure about the story of what we're angry about, or this way of going about to resolve it, or what we want, that risk jeopardizes that friendship and that community that you found through the anger. What I think is true about group anger, whether it's group anger as an activity or as a process, is that group anger coordinates imaginations. Now, I think that this happens in the individual case too, but just to a lesser extent. So when I'm angry, I express the anger, I bring it out because I want other people to join me. Maybe if they're very sympathetic, they'll also get angry with me. But at the very least, I want them to say, yes, I can see why you're angry, and I can see that we should do something about this. What you suffered was a wrong, and we should definitely work to right that wrong, right? So I think that happens in an individual case too, where I bring people in, I'm trying to persuade them to see things my way and to see how I was wronged, and that something needs to be done to bring about restitution or redress. Group anger too, I think it works exactly that same way when we're talking about group anger as a process, right? And this is why I think it's been an incredibly important political tool or force throughout history, right? So we use group anger as process in order to get people upset about something and highly motivated to do something to fix it, right? Group anger is an activity. It's not so much that you're trying to bring that group along into doing something in particular, but the way that group anger is an activity still, I think, really matters quite a bit in terms of politics, is the way that it's formative of group identity, right? So whether the identity is something like Tea Partiers or Never Trumpers, the thing that you're responding to, that you're saying, this is not, this is wrong, this is not right, we need to do something about it, that brings together a group and makes them recognize other people in that group. Okay. So we're ready now to get to the final section, right? And that's about the assault on the US Capitol. So as I said in my first main claim, I think the assault on the US Capitol is a case where the rhetoric of anger as a group activity was brought together with the practical pressures typical of anger as a process, and that this kind of volatile combination resulted in violent but also confused, incoherent actions. Now, I want to make an important caveat, right? And that is that I am not talking about the planners. And by planners, I mean both the people in the crowd, but also the people who planned the event organizers, right? I think there were definitely, I don't think that that January 6th would have unfolded the way it was if there weren't these planners there who had worked very, very hard for months in some cases, right, to make the things go the way that they did, right? Those people in the crowd who were planners, right, who brought like equipment and stuff, they're scary, right? But those are not the people I'm talking about. Event organizers, well, we started to see a little bit, I think, in the impeachment process about the kind of organization that went into January 6th. Anyways, those are not the people I'm talking about. Instead, the agents and actions that I'm talking about are, well, what I'm going to call the lowest level participants in January 6th. Now, the New York Times has this like very informative article about the 3 different levels of charges that the FBI has brought against participants. And the ones that I'm interested in, the ones that I'm trying to talk about and try to explain, are the lowest level, right? So the highest level were the people who are charged with conspiracy crimes or assault. And so, like I said, planners and also people who are like very radically violent. The lowest level, they've been charged with trespassing or disrupting Congress only. And that's about the level that I'm interested in analyzing. I also, though, want to be talking about the supporters at home. That is the people who were lending like moral or spiritual support to the people who were involved, right? Because I think they too had some of these features of incoherence or ambivalence about and thinking about what happened on January 6th. Oh, they're right there. That's the New York Times article. Okay, so again, my claim is that this group anger that we saw on January 6th was situated ambiguously between between activity, and process. Now, I think part of what made this so unstable and such a dangerous mix, this confused melange, as I have it in the slide, is the result of the forward-looking logic of anger, which is fundamentally structured like a process. So I think, and here I have my lovely little cartoon of Coyote and Roadrunner, right? Just like Coyote, where we all know what Coyote wants, right? He wants to catch Roadrunner. I think anger too has something that it wants. It wants revenge, punishment, however you want to cash out anger's aim, right? So there's something that anger is directed towards. And I think that even when anger is done as an activity, it can't just dispense with that kind of forward-looking aim, right? So I think that, it still is there and allowing for people to feel angry, even as, as activity, it's quite unusual to have a kind of destination that you're heading at, right? Again, as I mentioned with activity for Aristotle, the whole point of activity is very internally self-focused, right? But I think that we can see this in the lead up to the events of January 6th. So if you have somebody that, maybe you yourself actually, but if you know somebody, love somebody who's a Trump supporter, you saw in coming up to January 6th, so first there was a lot of talk about how the lawsuit that Texas was bringing to the Supreme Court, how this was going to be a big game changer, right? It was going to make it possible to recognize the way that the election had been stolen. After that failed, then there was a shift to the slates of electors and how this was going to make it possible for this fraudulent election to be righted. And then, after that, then all the attention moved to January 6th. And for about 3 weeks or so, there was this like steady drumbeat of January 6th, January 6th, January 6th being the day that at last we were going to stop the steal and save the country from this fraudulent election. I think we see here something like the tension or difficulty of trying to do anger as activity, even though anger is teleologically structured like a process, right? So there's this kind of perpetually, oh, this thing's about to come true, right? This goal that the anger is directed at, even as there's no thought about how it's going to happen or what we have to do to bring it about, right? There's just right. So there's something that it was wanted, right? To stop the steal or to save America, even just the slogan, make America great again. But then there was no clear kind of way to do that. I don't know, Cavell has this example in Must We Mean What We Say of the yokel in the audience who rushes on stage to save Desdemona from Othello. And I think something like this is visible here, right? Where there's a thought about what the anger wanted, right? What its goal was. But there was absolutely, there was very little thought put into how do we do this? How do we actually accomplish this in any way that involved the participants themselves who were angry? Now the thing that so I'm trying to talk about these people, these actions that have this kind of ambivalence or incoherence. And I think that the crucial the thing that I'm interested in is a certain kind of ambivalence about what was done. And I think we saw this right away, right? So for people who were supporters or interested in what the participants were trying to do, there was this immediate description of these people as being, like our founding fathers in 1776. These people are patriots, right? They're fighting to save our country. And then almost immediately, there was this kind of oscillation to those people are Antifa, right? Those people are thugs. They're, in disguise. They're bad. We need to stop them, right? I think, we saw this actually supposedly in the president's own conversation with Kevin McCarthy, but I have an example here from an actual participant. So this is a quote from Jenna Ryan. And Jenna Ryan gave an interview with Cynthia McFadden of NBC's Today Show. And Cynthia McFadden was talking about, the way that it seems like the supporters are willing to condone violence in order to, right the wrong of having the election stolen from them. And, the Jenna Ryan actually claims, no, President Trump couldn't have known that there had been Antifa thugs in the crowd who were going to do this. And McFadden corrects her and says, no, in fact, they were Trump supporters. And so this was her response. Well, that's contrary to what I believe and contrary to what my news sources say. Knowing Trump supporters to be God-loving people who love America, I can't imagine being the ones to break a window. I can't even fathom that. So she herself says multiple times that she does not condone violence, that she condemns all violent acts. And here she has this idea that, who these people were, they would not have done violence. And yet here's a tweet that she posted on that very day. And I can't really read it because it's a little covered on my screen, but it says something like, so it's the window at the Capitol building. She says something like, and if the news doesn't stop reporting lies, we're going to come to their studios next, right? So it's not just that she seems to be acknowledging or recognizing that these broken windows were done by Trump supporters. She actually seems to be threatening violence herself and saying, okay, we're going to come for you next, right? So she's using the violence to try to advance her political goals and values. Even as she has said, on the other hand, I would never support violence. And Trump supporters would never support violence. This is also visible in the ProPublica summary of Parler videos, So, Parler, actually it's up, I guess back up now, but maybe in a limited form. Parler is a place that many Trump supporters posted videos of what they were up to on that day. And as it was so Amazon Cloud Services stopped supporting it or allowing it to use it. But just before it was taken down, somebody scraped about 500 videos from Parler and then gave them to ProPublica. ProPublica watched all 500 videos and they wrote up a summary of what they saw. And it's a really amazing summary. I highly recommend reading it, but here's just one moment inside the summary. So, and when two men who have, to great applause, climbed up onto a painter's rig dangling from the building and start trying to break the windows, the crowd turns on them. Don't break my house, someone shouts. No, no, no. It's not hard to imagine the perplexity on the part of those attempting the violent break-in. Are you all trying to invade this building or aren't you? I think here we see again this kind of ambivalent movement, this oscillating movement between attacking and I don't know, like just observing or documenting, or right, where we have this kind of cheering, right, the symbolism of surmounting the building, climbing up on the Capitol building, right. But then once the man who climbed up to great cheers starts to actually break in by breaking a window, then so is doing an clear act of destruction or defiling the Capitol building, then at least some people in the crowd get nervous about what's happening, and they want to reject it or refuse it as what they want to be a part of, right? And I think this is important because the Capitol building, I mean, what the protesters were screaming for, well, they were screaming many things, but one of the things they were screaming was, "It's our house," right? So the Capitol building is symbolic of what they were claiming as their own, the US government, and the thing that they were in a sense trying to save. So I think this confusion about, are you trying to get into the Capitol building, whatever it means it takes to do that, or you're trying to protect it, right, from being overrun by, I don't know, false, false owners, right? Okay. Now I want to just quickly go through 3 elements that I'm saying were here and present on January 6th that made the event unfold in the way it did. So the first one is the one that I've already been talking to a great deal, and this is the habit that the participants had of intense group anger as activity. Now, I think one of the things that happens when you're doing group anger as activity is you get to say very like wild, extreme things, right? It's like a way of turning the volume up, right? Because you don't really need to act on it or follow through on it. So you can say all sorts of things that, are, well, extreme and intense, right? So I think people were used to doing that. They were used to seeing that and like having fun with that, right? I think another thing that was there is that even as they were used to this kind of like wild, big, large talk, the thing that happened on that day is that big, wild talk was put into a context where there was a clear opportunity for actions that follow through on that angry talk, right? So they were told repeatedly, "Now, here, fight." And here's a quote from U.S. Representative Joe Neguse, from the impeachment trial. So Magoo says, "And what time was that rally scheduled for? The exact same time that this chamber was certifying the election results in joint session. When did he conclude his speech? Literally moments before Speaker Pelosi had gavelled us into session. How did he conclude that infamous speech? With a final call to action. He told them to march down Pennsylvania Avenue, to come here, that it was their patriotic duty to do so because the election had been stolen. And when they heard his speech, they understood his words and what they meant because they had heard it before." So that is the talk that they had heard and they participated in for quite some time. This group anger as activity was fight, fight, fight. You need to fight like hell for your country. And then that was put into this context where it's now you need to fight right now. And here you need to fight right here, right? And this was very, this is unusual for group activity, group anger as an activity, but it was part of what happened on that day. Finally, I think a third element that's very important for understanding what unfolded is the actual physical presence of other people. Now, I think group anger as an activity is something that lots of us do, but when we do it, it's usually mediated through screens. That is, we're participating in communities, but we're doing it on our phones, on our iPads, whatever, right? Here, there was actual people there. And because there was actual people there, they were able to see what you were doing. So in a sense, there was a kind of like your status as a member in the group was put into question in a way that normally it's not, because you're operating through a screen. And so if you didn't join in, if you didn't join the crowd, there was a way that you didn't really belong there, right? That you weren't part of the group. And I think this had a lot to do with the way that people just kind of went along. So what did the participants actually do? I think there's no one right answer here, right? In some sense, all the answers are right. They stormed, they played, they fought, they documented, right? I do think what's very interesting and very telling is the way that being there was the point. So one thing that they definitely did is they took all sorts of pictures of themselves to document their participation. And this is, I think, part of the way that what they were doing was still this kind of group activity, right? They were just saying, I'm fighting for Trump, right? And this was an important part of what they were up to, and their pride in that, in showing that this kind of symbolic performance of fighting, right? They were like, but they also were looking, I mean, it was almost like a political tourism unbound or something like that. Now, I don't mean to minimize what happened. There were very real consequences to this performance of fighting, right? There was a woman who was trampled to death, beyond just the woman who was shot, others who died. There was a police officer beaten to death, police officers injured, police officers traumatized. I don't know, there was a story about the 2 police officers who killed themselves in the Post. It's very upsetting. Other police officers who had to turn in their guns because of the worries about self-harm. I think this was a national trauma, right? But part of what makes it so traumatic is the way that it was very much self-inflicted. This is us. This is the United States. We did this. Now, I'm going to conclude by talking a bit about the political dangers of anger as a group activity. I think what happened on January 6th is very atypical for group anger as an activity. That is, I think it's very unusual for the entire group to make an attack as a group if they're used to anger as an activity, right? The whole point of anger as an activity, the way that it becomes fun and easy, is because it's very dissociated from action, right? So I think that what happened on January 6th, it actually required a lot of external planning and motivation that is not normally found within group anger as an activity. But I do think that group anger as an activity is incredibly politically dangerous. It's extremely pernicious. And the reason why it's extremely pernicious is because of its everyday effect. And I think it has at least 2 everyday effects that I want to mention. So first, as I talked about with activity snowballs. So when you do group anger as an activity, I think it leads to increased radicalization, right? You do it and you do it more and more, and it leads you to, go further into this anger, right? Where it becomes more extreme, more pronounced, more consuming. I think that's very bad. I think another thing that it does is I think it cultivates an indifference toward truth. I think as you continue to be angry over and over again at certain people that you stop thinking of as opponents and you start thinking of as enemies, I think this makes you think about truth as something that is dispensable, right? If it helps you, truth is great, right? Because it can be a weapon you use to defeat your enemies, right? But if it gets in the way, just get rid of it, right? Because the important thing is to stop these people, because these people have wronged us, right? They've done something very bad and dangerous, and we need to stop them, right? And to fix what's gone wrong. So I think that this makes the truth something that you stop caring about. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, great. Well, now, Scott, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Erica. Fantastic. Great job. Super interesting, engaging, really timely topic. It's a real privilege to be here with you to talk a little bit about this. It's one of the great pleasures of this fellowship has been the opportunity to engage with scholars in different fields, and you have certainly brought a really interesting, compelling dimension to the mix this year, and we all appreciate it very much. So I wanted to maybe start with the end, and that is your warning, if you will, about what this could lead to in terms of the obliteration of the truth. And I'm wondering if this increasing indifference toward truth, if you think that this sort of those who defend the truth, seek the truth, engage in the pursuit of the truth and investigate evidence and truth, evidence-based assertions. If we're starting to see a cleavage in our society, I mean, we are so fragmented, but along those lines between truth seekers and those for whom truth is a malleable thing, that a malleable set of alternative facts, and what you think about that as a possibility and what that portends for our nation and our society.
Good. You know, I realize now that I forgot something to talk that but your very good question reminded me. So I'm going to just say it now. So I think that, yes, there is this cleavage that's happening. And I think it's because, well, I don't think so. I don't know. In psychology, if someone's suffering like a delusion, you don't confront them about the delusion, right? That's not helpful or productive. That makes them further paranoid and angry and upset with you because you're calling them into question. And I saw a piece today that had an argument something like that too, where it's like we think that maybe exposure to different ideas will make us more willing to countenance those ideas. But actually it looks like, you know, at least in the psychology experience I was looking at, that's not true. That actually exposure to other ideas, it's felt as threatening, right? And so like further cements us to our understanding of what's going on because of the way that it like risks our identity in seeing these things. We feel this as an attack. The thing I forgot to say was about this, I meant to talk when I was talking about friendship. There's this wonderful piece in the New York Times by Stuart Thompson where he talked about listening in on a QAnon chat room for about 3 weeks. And it was a little bit before the Capitol assault, all the way up through the inauguration. And he describes how the QAnon chat room was, as he described it, load bearing, right? That these people were using this chat room to hold a load in their lives that they needed help. Right. So he describes how in down moments, they would talk about their difficulty affording health insurance or the shame of having to go on government assistance or problems of connecting with their kids. And what they were finding in this chat room was friends, right? People to talk about these things with them. And I think this is like part of the very difficult thing about group anger as an activity and why I don't think there's any good, easy answers here. Because I think that the anger itself feels pleasurable. It feels like you're powerful and you're justified and you're like a crusader for what's right. And it also allows you to have friendship. And quite honestly, I think almost all of us are very lonely. Right? And I think that, you know, these people who are participating in this ability to feel like moral outrage and to feel connected to others, this is like a very, very powerful force in their lives. And it makes their lives feel meaningful and significant in ways that, you know, lots of times other things in their lives aren't working. And so I don't know if there's a very good answer for how to deal with this or how to move forward with this. But I definitely do think that we should be very worried about it.
And what do you think distinguishes, you know, the movement today? For example, I don't know if what you might call it, the MAGA movement or the agglomeration of people who support Trump or his base. How does these dynamics, the dynamics of this sort of movement differ from pre-social media, you know, before the ubiquity of smart devices and cell phones? Is there an appreciable difference, do you think?
Yes, I definitely think so. So actually, again, I was just reading today an article. It was a Thomas Edsall in the New York Times, and he was talking about the role that technology has played in fostering these like online communities. And he gave, I mean, he talked, I mean, it was other experts, right? But they named in several factors that have made things. So first off, I think there just is now this history. I mean, actually, I think Rush Limbaugh was a great innovator here. And this is why I mentioned him very briefly in the talk. I think he figured out a way to make anger fun. But then I think that, you know, so he did that, and that was in a sense before people were really online in the way that they are now. But I do think that being online has, in a sense, accelerated something that was already present, right? And this is because, and you know, some of the things that came up in the Edsall article, so you're able to find other very extreme people in a way that you wouldn't have been able to prior to the internet, right? So normally, like somebody who had these like very angry, extreme views, they wouldn't have had anyone to connect with and develop that kind of friendship with. Whereas now they can, right? Another thing they talk about is the way that social media selects for, you know, in a sense, outrage and the most outrageous, right? So this has this kind of escalating effect. another, well, so I'll just stop at those. But yeah, so I definitely think that what we're seeing, I do think that there has been anger as an activity. Like, I don't think this is a new possibility. I think it's happened. I think well, no, we've had hate groups in the past, right? But but I do think that it has a new form, and it's just become able to become so much more dominant. Just so many more people participating in it because of the way that it's going through these different kinds of technology forms. Right?
Thank you for that. We've got a number of questions, so I'd like to start in and get to as many as we can. From Marie Coppola, thanks for the talk. Could you comment on the connection between group anger as process and the analysis of groups like QAnon as being structured like online games? And there's a link to a documentary with her question. So.
Good. No, I read a really great piece about this. Actually, I think it might have been in that QAnon chat room one, but I think that part of what makes QAnon, well, made it as successful as it has become. I mean, I read a thing today that said 1 in 3 Republicans say that they believe in it, right? Which seems crazy high, but anyways, is the way that there is this kind of puzzle game-like structure where you're supposed to put the clues together and you yourself get to do it, right? And I think this is how games work. So games are this interesting kind of hybrid case of what Aristotle is talking about, right? Because games have process structure in the sense that there's steps that you have to go through in order to do them, right? But the reason we do games is like for leisure, right? We do them in order to play the game. Right. And so I think that the like Q's prophecies, right, that these function very similar to this, like where you're supposed to put it together yourself and you're supposed to notice connections and use that to explain the world. So it has this very actually basic, I mean, Aristotle starts in metaphysics by saying all men desire to know, right? And it's like that sense, like that, aha, like I figured something out. It's like really fun, right? So I think definitely that that QAnon is this kind of interesting, the way that it works, the way that people get invested in it is the way it's functioning both as activity, and then there's these process-like elements that make it feel like you're moving forward and getting deeper.
Great. So this is a question from Paul Bloomfield. Hi, Paul. Super interesting talk. Thanks so much. This may be a bit off topic if the focus is supposed to be on group anger, but I'd love to hear more about the pleasures of individual anger. If you think these exist, I guess in the context of, what we're discussing here, anger is not supposed to be pleasurable since it's based on being harmed, but there are some who seem to relish their anger, nourish it, etc. How can we make sense of the phenomenology of simultaneously feeling harmed and feeling pleasure? Thanks.
Great. Very good question, Paul. So I actually, my writing group knows that this is like something I've been writing about for a while, actually, because I think this is like the first starting point. Because I do think like typically both philosophers and psychologists have thought of anger as a negative emotion, right? A negative affect, right? And that exactly because of what you say, because it's something that happens to you, it's clearly a harm. We don't want, I think, a fairly, rational, well-functioning person, they don't want to be angry all the time, right? That doesn't seem like a fun way to be in the world. Certainly not desirable. But then you're absolutely right, Paul, that there are lots of people who are like that, right? And I think, normally, I would say that in a sense it's functioning. So I think it's either functioning as a source of pleasure for them, or it's functioning as a source of like neurotic, like managing, so like a kind of adaptive maneuver, that the anger is there to help them get through the world. And I think this can happen from like a very young age, actually, where you get used to using anger in certain ways to manage like stressful situations. And then you keep deploying it and are noticing that the person is like angry in a way that doesn't really make sense to the context is a way of talking about how the anger has become maladaptive, right? The anger is not functioning the way it should. For Aristotle, the goal of individual anger is to do anger at the right time, in the right way, against the right people, with the right tools, right? So he has this whole very long description. And then he says, It's really hard to do that, right? But he says, what we do is we don't blame people for messing up a little, because that's so hard to do. We blame people for messing up a lot. And I think that's right. So people who are like messing up a lot with anger, then we're like, okay, those people are scary or uncomfortable and we don't like being around them, right? But certainly they have, what are called vicious habits of anger. And I think that's because their anger is providing maybe a kind of pleasure or a kind of security for how they move through the world.
Excellent. Here's a comment from Lynn Tribble. Anger got them there, but it seemed like the dominant emotion was euphoria.
Good. I agree, but then I feel unsure. So I definitely think that a lot of them were feeling euphoria. And actually, so when I gave a different version of my a different talk from this book to a different audience, I had somebody point out that anger, when they do psychological testing, is often very closely associated with euphoria, which I think is like an interest. I mean, I think that goes with the thing I've been trying to say about the pleasure that's inherent to the feeling of anger, right? That there's a kind of like, right? That feels good. I don't know. It feels, and I think that that's part. I mean, this is why I think it's kind of attractive to get angry at times, right? There's something fun about being pissed off, as long as it's not how you feel all the time. And yeah, so I definitely think that there was this kind of symbolic success, right? Where their anger got to where it wanted to go, in the sense that they got into the Capitol, right? But then again, this is where I think the Cavell thing about the story of like trying to save Desdemona really helps. Because like, what were they trying to do anyways, right? Did they think that like martial law was going to be declared, or that like they were actually going to take over the government and start to, I don't know, have like Trump be president? It's not at all clear what victory would have been, but they did feel like they had gotten it, right? There was this kind of symbolic victory that seems like a lot of them were celebrating, right? When they were like waving their trophies around and very happy. So I do agree that definitely euphoria was present, definitely anger was present, but I do think that that kind of quick backlash to Antifa shows the way that there was a kind of insecurity that was running throughout about what they were doing, how it made sense, whether or not it was justified, right? And I think the thing is that they were confronted with the violence in a way that they couldn't ignore, even as they were ignoring it as it was unfolding. So,
very good point. Yeah, this is a question from Michael. One of the really interesting things about the idea of group anger as an activity is that activities can be planned, produced, and managed. Activities can also be done theatrically or insincerely for purposes of entertainment or manipulation. Do you think that can happen with group anger in the political context?
Yeah, good. I think we saw, I mean, I think January 6th was that. I don't know what to say. Like, I think like it was large. I mean, I've read now multiple descriptions of that event as some kind of weird form of performance art. And obviously that's a little tongue in cheek, but I do think that what they were doing is they were videoing themselves, like, I don't know, holding Nancy Pelosi's sign to her office or something like that, right? Where it was like this kind of, I don't know, where they, I mean, that's what the fighting was, this kind of weird sort of acting it out. And them like getting, I mean, I don't know. I mean, they made a gallows, right? But it, like nobody, I mean, thank God nobody was hung, right? Like so I think that the theatricality was there. But I think this is, so Michael, I guess I'm not exactly sure. So I think that Aristotle at least would say, and I'm not sure whether or not I agree with this yet, but I think Aristotle would say anger as an activity is a kind of perversion. Like it doesn't really work, right? That's because anger is supposed to be, teleologically structured like a process. And so when we try to stretch it out and make it into an activity, it has these kinds of like stumbling points, right? Because it's not supposed to be that way. This is the same way. I mean, Aristotle gives the example of the gourmand who prays for the throat of a crane so he can like feel the food going down all the way, right? So that's dragging out the pleasure that you get from eating. And you're like, that's who wants a neck like a crane? That's crazy, right? So I think that there's something like, I think Aristotle think that. I'm not sure if I think that yet, but I do think that right now anger as an activity is very much structured around this kind of theatrical performance, because that's how you get to have its pleasure or get to participate in it. And so it's not like a process.
Can you talk about, this is from Suzanne Andrus, can you please talk about how gender factors in here?
So I had to confess, when I first was thinking about this book, I was thinking about Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings and the way gender was used there, and anger, and the way that anger, as a group versus anger as an individual was at stake, but then also who was able to be angry and how that anger was able to be expressed, right? And so I was very interested in thinking about, the way that gender matters for the possibility of using anger as a tool, as a process to get what you want. I've read studies where they've used people and they thought that they were jurors, and they had either a woman or some member of a minority use anger, and they gave exactly the same script to the woman or to the minority member and to a white man. And the white man was able to use the anger to convince the other jurors to go the way that the anger was going. Whereas when the woman or the minority person used anger, it actually made them seem irrational, and it made them less effective in terms of like moving the jurors, moving their fellow jurors to see things their way. And so I think there's like a lot of really hard, difficult questions here about, this is, I think, part of the way that Aristotle is absolutely right to think about the way that anger is about social status, right? So when I'm angry that somebody has treated me in a way that I don't think I deserve. And so they've like pushed me down. And so I want to punch myself back up with my anger. But, being pushed down is like a lot worse if you have like higher social status. So like if you're a man versus a woman, or if you're white versus, some member of a minority community. And so I think that, I don't know, there's just a lot of really hard questions here about who gets to be angry and how effective a tactic it is if, for different people.
There were certainly plenty of women on hand in the Capitol that day.
There were a lot of women, but not that many non-white people, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. This is a question from our fellow Betsy Athens. This is so fascinating, not to mention timely. I'm curious if the difference between activity and process is this confusion of figurative and literal. They had been operating rhetorically on a figurative level of fighting.
Yeah.
And then the group created an opportunity for literal fighting, maybe? Such a great talk, Erica.
Yeah, thanks, Betsy. I do think that's something like what like it was like a weird, so Michael mentioned the theatricality. I think it was like a scene shift almost, something like that, right? So again, listening, Jenna Ryan was talking about, she herself had never been to a MAGA rally, but I think that's kind of what a lot of these people were expecting, something like a MAGA rally where you get to scream about how angry you are and how all these people have done you wrong, and then you go home and it's like fun and fine, right? You don't have to do anything beyond that. And I think that's what they went for. And then all of a sudden it's like the background changed. So I was like, no, now here, do it. And I just think it was like very confusing. Jenna Ryan describes how there was gentlemen in the crowd who were like telling them where to go and telling them to push, and how she thought it was very like, and it's like, so I do think that there was a lot of things there. But the weird thing, so I am very interested, like the thing I'm trying to describe is the people who were incited. But I do think part of what makes this all very tricky is that when you're in a group, once you're incited, this kind of nice clean line between being incited and being an inciter starts to go away. Because then once you start doing it, then you're also like working on others to get them to join in too and do it, right? And this is the way that this like kind of group pressure builds. And this is why Freud thinks that groups have this kind of group mind that's basically like the subconscious, right? So I do think that in a sense you're right, that there was this like way of talking that normally was like, again, fairly divorced from action. And then they were like, no, you've talked the talk, now walk the walk, right? You got to do it, right? And I think that seemed like a very convincing, instruction or claim or, direction about what they should do, because of the way, again, I think anger is fundamentally structured like a process where you're not supposed to talk it unless you're willing to walk it, right? So yeah, it's a very good question, Betsy.
Great, and great answer. I have a question here from Dabney Waring. I'm wondering what you mean by political danger here. Are there emancipatory possibilities for this strange melange? Also, relatedly, would you consider this to apply to the post-recession Occupy movement as well? Infamously, without concrete demands, yet very much a source of identity for the people who participated, fueled by anger.
Definitely. I definitely think Occupy Wall Street is something like this interesting mix where they did have some things that they wanted, but like it wasn't really anything that they could themselves do. And it was kind of just about being there. Like I think that's the key feature of activity that's really interesting about January 6th and also about Occupy Wall Street, where the point is to be there and to be doing it, right? And that's what the person wants. And I think you're absolutely right to say, and that starts to function as a source of identity. Now, is there kind of liberatory potential here? I think anger can be good, right? So that I think that I'm going to say that most obviously or easily anger is good when it's a process, when it's structured like a process, and when it's like right. So like, I don't know how to say this besides just using Aristotle. I mean, for Aristotle, you've got to be seeing what's actually truly happening. So you've got to be right that this is an actual injustice that's happened, that this is like very wrong, and that we need to do something about it to fix it, right? So I think anger can be great. Like I think it's very politically important. Actually, I think it really matters too in individual lives. Like getting angry and standing up for yourself is incredibly important. I think it can be incredibly empowering, but again, only if you're right, right? If you're right about what you're angry about, the fact that it's like not acceptable. Right?
Well, and then we have from Tracy Yanera. Wonderful talk, thank you. May I ask you to talk more about the relationship between group anger and power? The many clips, photographs of the Capitol riot showed so much pride and arrogance from those taking part in it, and they seem to be taking pleasure in terrifying and intimidating those who may be witnessing the entire thing. The euphoria, as Everin Tribble puts it above. This doesn't strike me as the same horrifying power vibe you get from Black Lives Matter.
Good. I've read some studies now. So in general, anger tends to increase or heighten when the group that's feeling that anger is out of power. And this is interesting because that wasn't true during the Trump presidency. Right? So normally the fact that Trump was president and the Republicans controlled Congress, at least for a good chunk of the time that Trump was president, would have meant that the anger, if there was anger, would have been growing on the left, right? But in fact, it was growing on the right. And I think this has a lot to do with the way that Trump was president, right? Where he often would voice a lot of grievances, direct a lot of grievances to people. So you were able to feel aggrieved with Trump, even though he was, arguably the most powerful person in the world. Now, this relationship between group anger and power, I think that this is a very good point you're making. I think anger is a way of making yourself feel more powerful and to push back against somebody that's managed to hurt you or wrong you in some way. And sometimes you can be punching down in the sense of like going after someone that you think didn't show you proper respect, but should have. So I think, you can imagine a king, for instance, who's upset because his slave didn't show proper deference. And so he like has his head chopped off or something. But I think more typically anger, because it's about, oh, this person matters enough to me to be upset about it, the anger looks towards some people who are like roughly your equal. And I think that getting angry is scary. It is like when someone is angry, you're like, okay, all of a sudden it becomes, anger is very inarticulate, it's very physical, it's very loud, right? And I think that there is a kind of enjoyment that you get from being angry. And I think that what we see often is actually kind of very dangerous oscillation between anger and fear. where you feel worried or fearful or anxious about something, and then that makes you feel vulnerable, and then you get angry or upset that you felt that that anxiety and that fear. And so anger can be a kind of response to that feeling of being out of control, because it can give you a kind of feeling of control. I also think that lots of times, like when we are mistreated in our own personal lives, there's not a lot we can do to like push back, right? So even though we might feel very angry about the wrong that we've suffered at the hands of someone who has power over us, we might not be able to push back because maybe it's our boss, or maybe, right, somebody that we don't get to say, you know, here's what you did. Well, here's why what you did was wrong. And then I think that anger, because it doesn't have a way to get expressed, it gets maybe funneled in other directions. And that's this kind of response to feeling vulnerable and not being able to do it. So I definitely think all anger starts from this kind of constriction on agency. And then that's part of what makes it feel good, right? Is that you're saying, I'm strong enough to be angry at the very least.
Great. So we have time for just one more question, even though there are still many in the queue. From Clifton Lee. Is it not like a process because it is a crowd and not an individual? Do you have any thoughts about Elias Canetti's views on the nature of crowds, e.g. humans don't like to be touched except in a crowd, and how the crowd aspect distorts the classical Aristotelian view of anger?
I am really interested. So I am just started thinking about this. I've been thinking about individual anger more, and then January 6th happened, and it's like, okay, I was gonna get there anyways, but it kind of like sped things up. So, so I'm gonna think more about this recommendation about touching in crowds, because I think that's very interesting. I do think, like, I think Freud is right. And I had originally on my group versus individual anger slide, I had some quotes from Freud, because I think Freud is right to say, actually, groups think differently than individuals think. I think Freud, now for the most part for Freud, they think differently in a way that's kind of dangerous, right? Because they kind of like revert to this kind of lowest subconscious level of thinking where they become more impulsive, they become less critical, they become less interested in figuring out what's actually true, and they just want what's appearance, they just want, you know, image. I think Freud's right about all that. Now he does think that groups can like rise to do incredibly impressive things morally in a way that like an individual, it's harder for an individual to do that. So groups in some sense can egg you on to be better. But normally Freud thinks groups drag us down, and they allow, like they like in a sense allow us to violate our normal moral beliefs and principles, right? And I definitely think that I guess I think it's an interesting suggestion that this might have something to do with our ability to feel connected to others, and that these are like kind of reinforcing, but I just have to think more. So
Well, we'll look forward to those thoughts.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Scott, and thank you, Erica. This has been a great conversation. Join me in thanking our speakers today.
Yes, and thank you everyone for your questions. Great, awesome stuff.